Hello everyone, it's us here at Come On Poker. Today we have a video for beginners and we're going to talk about a very basic poker concept, which is the continuation bet. That's used quite often in poker. So we're going to just explain the basics today since you're all beginners. And then I'm going to teach you little by little the different elements and techniques of the game. So we'll start by explaining about the continuation bet. We'll use an example since that's the simplest way for you to see what it is. So here is a tab from Come On Poker. We have 2 4s. Everyone has passed and it's our turn. So we have a jack and a 9 of hearts, which we think is strong enough to open up here. So we open with 12 and the blindfold, followed by the small blind, the big blind, who is Boris 56, and the flop is complete. 3, 4, 2, and now's the time when you can decide whether or not to place a continuation bet. Boris checks, and if you want to make a continuation bet, then this would mean that we want to go again. So we had the initiative after the flop, so we have the power. Boris 56 is content to pay up. He's tried to attack us, and now we're on the defensive. So we can continue being aggressive on the flop if he checks. And that's the continuation bet. Now we're going to look at 2 more examples. So this play here is used quite often because we've shown our confidence before the flop, and so now we want to continue putting pressure on the other players after the flop. And the reason for doing this can be very diverse. So it could be that we actually have a very good hand, or it could be that we don't really know if we have a good hand yet or not, so we're just going to go for it. Now we're going to look at some good reasons for why you want to make a continuation bet. So the first reason, and perhaps the most evident, is the value. This means that we have valued our hand, we have a good hand, the flop worked into our hand perfectly, and we're going to continue betting because we want to call attention to the fact that there can't be many hands out there in the game that are better than our own. And this is what we call making a continuation bet by value. Now, another possibility is that the flop makes our hand useless, or the flop doesn't really help us tremendously, but since we were confident before the flop, and we don't want our opponents to think that the flop helped them either, we still want to be perceived as having a strong hand after the flop. So we're going to put in a continuation bet by bluff. Now, the third of our 4 examples, the third possibility is that the flop works into our hand, but there are probably better hands out there than ours. But the problem is that everyone around us is betting, and we have to follow suit. Since this isn't always so clear, we're going to look at a few examples. So now the first of 4 examples. Here we have an ace and a queen, and we're up first. So we have a strong enough hand to open up the betting. The players are folding one after the other, and only one person is calling our bet, and that's Renee. The flop drops, and it's a flop that's extremely great for us since there's a queen in there. So now we have a pair of queens and an ace high. So we're in a pretty strong position right now, so we're going to go ahead and place a continuation bet. Now Renee has checked, and we continue by placing another continuation bet by value to make the others pay us. So, for example, we hope that this will cause 2 more hands to pay up. Our dear Renee, who could have a jack, queen in her hand, queen 10, queen 9, maybe queen 8. They could be hands like a pair of 9s or a pair of 8s, a pair of 7s, hands with a 7 and a 6, 8 and a 6, 4 and a 5, etc. They could have any number of hands that they would bet on with the current game. So we're quite happy to make them pay, and with the flop on any number of these hands. So Now let's look at the second of 4 examples. We have a pair of 9s and we're up first. So we open the bet and we have once again made Renee pay. The flop drops and we got a king and 4 and a 4. It's a flop that once again is very often will play into our hand. So in fact, since we have 2 4s high, for example, if we were to have an ace, king, ace, queen, or something like that, and we actually have a 1 in 3 chance in our hand to get an ace, king, a king, or an ace on the flop. It's good that most of the time we're the first to go after the flop, and here it's very possible that he's crossed over and missed the flop. So it's fairly safe to assume that we have the best hand with a pair of 9s. However, many times other players will continue to bet us. So a 10 will bet us, a 9, a queen, an ace will bet us. So if we check now, we risk having the best hand but not seeing it through if there aren't any hands out there that would have made us lose. So here we could place a continuation bet for protection. And that's what we'll do here. So we often think that we have the best hand, but we don't see it through because we don't want to have a card like an ace, for example, come along that'll make us lose everything. So here we've placed a continuation bet for protection. Now, the third example, we open with an ace and a queen, and we're up again. Renee has called our bet, and at this time the flop drops with a king, an 8, and a 4. This isn't a flop that helps us out too much because there's neither an ace nor a queen. And we're not really sure that we can put the cards in the flop into our hand. However, as we say, we still have a 2 in 3 chance that we have the best hand after the flop. So there, we're going to go ahead and place a continuation bet because this flop doesn't really help our adversary either. And if he doesn't have a king or an 8, then he'll fold. So we'll place a continuation bet here by bluff. So we've seen the 3 reasons for placing a continuation bet by bluff, value, and for protection. And now we're going to try to explain when we should use each of these. We're not always going to place a continuation bet. We're not always going to use it. When should we use it? When should we not use it? So we're going to get into a lot. We're not going to get into a lot of detail, but we're just going to review the basics. By value, we're pretty much always going to place a continuation bet because we're almost guaranteed to make everyone else pay up. And there are a few cases where there's an exception, and that's when we have an extremely strong hand, and as the bet goes around, we don't want to let our opponent know how strong our hand is up front. Now, another example that's also quite rare is when our adversary may not have quite as strong of a hand, but we can force him to bluff to continue in the game. But it's very rare. We're going to see that 99% of the time when we have a good hand and the flop hasn't helped our opponent at all, for example, sometimes we cannot let him know how strong our hand is up front. Another possibility, which is also very rare, is when our adversary has a very particular strategy and he's bet a lot, we can from time to time force him to bluff. But this is very rare. We're going to say that 99% of the time when we have bet our hand and there are a lot of other good hands in the game, 99% of the time we'll place a continuation bet by value. But when we bluff, it's different. We bluff and there are 2 different situations. One where we should place a continuation bet and another where we should not place a continuation bet. The first thing that's fairly evident, if there are several adversaries still in the game, the bluff has less of a chance of being successful because there's a greater possibility that one or more of our opponents has a very strong hand after the flop, and he won't want to lose it. He won't be content to just pass with that kind of hand. So it's quite simple to place a continuation bet by bluff when we have 1 or maybe 2 opponents, but there it could become a little bit complicated, and it would be better to simply abandon the bet or check or maybe see if the second flop plays into our hand. Another situation in which we'll bluff is when the flop is dry, sec in French, meaning that we can't connect the flop with our hand at all. If there are a lot of straights or flushes, we'll see that often. If they haven't got a pair, then we're going to want to get either a flush or a straight flush. And really our bluff has very little chance of getting by because there are still hands out there that are way better than our own. So there's two situations that you could be faced with when you're deciding whether or not to place a continuation bet by bluff. And if the flop is dry, it's better not to bet by bluff. Now, let's move on to the continuation bet for protection. Is it a good idea to protect ourselves or not? Honestly, this is a lot more subtle, and I'm not going to get into details of whether we should protect ourselves or not. Simply, it's quite simple, and I'll show you a few examples, but it's a subject that is a bit complex that we can't really get into today. Now, the first of four examples, here we have an ace and a queen. So here we're going to go with a value bet. We're going to play here, as I explained earlier, we're going to place a bet here because we have a pair of queens. But the same would be true if we had a pair of sixes, a pair of sevens, a pair of eights. And here again, if we have 2, 3, 4, 5 opponents, it's not so bothersome because we have a better hand. So here we're going to place a continuation bet by value, especially since not everyone is still in the game. There really aren't any reasons why we shouldn't place a continuation bet in this case. So when we have a valuable hand, we must always be ready to place a continuation bet. When we bluff, here we have an ace and a queen with a king, an 8 and a 4 on the flop. And we're going to go ahead and try to place a continuation bet up against only one opponent, since it's a dry flop, as we explained earlier. Now, dry just means that the flop isn't really connected with our hand. There are very few chances of a straight or a flush. Here, we may have a possibility of a small straight with just a 5. There's not many other cards, so it's not very connected at all. There's a king that can bring value to many cards as if it's worth 10 points here in this hand. So here we're going to bluff. If there aren't many opponents, we're in good shape because the flop is dry and because there are very few players left. Now, here we're in the same situation with an ace and a queen up against Renee, who has already paid up, and here this hand is very well connected. It's the complete opposite of a dry flop. So here he has a diamond, if he has a 9, if he has a 10, if she has a 6, if she has an 8, or maybe even if she has a 7, she's going to go ahead and place a continuation bet. If she has a great hand, we may not win the pot. So here our bluff will very rarely work because the flop is very well connected. So in this situation, we're not going to place a continuation bet by bluff for a very strong reason. Here is the case of protection. So we have a pair of 9s. The flop is a king, a 4, and a 4. So we shouldn't place a bet based on value because here there are quite a few hands that could be better than ours. But we're going to make them pay. And maybe somebody has a pair of 7s, a pair of 8s, a pair of 6s, a pair of 5s, a pair of 3s, a pair of 2s, or hands like that. Maybe an ace and a jack, maybe an ace and a queen. There are quite a few hands that would be willing to pay up in this instance since everyone has at least a pair of 4s and a king high. So here we can't really say that it's a continuation bet by value because we're going to perhaps most often force people to pay up who have both higher and lower hands. So it's not really a value-based bet. It's not a bluff-based bet because here even the lower hands are going to pay up, and because we often think that we have the best hand even if we don't. But just in case, we're going to go ahead and place a continuation bet for protection. Now, furthermore, it would be to our advantage to not place a continuation bet here too quickly, just to protect ourselves, because quite often there's someone else who has a better hand than ours. So here we decided to place the continuation bet because there are very few players left and because we have a greater chance of having the better hand. Here's another example to show you the complexity. And because we really should ask ourselves, why are we making the decisions that we are? Here, can we place a continuation bet? It's not so easy to determine. Here, can we place a continuation bet by value? I mean, we can. We can make others pay up a little bit more than a pair of aces, perhaps. Emmerich might pay up, maybe someone else with a pair of nines, a pair of tens, a pair of jacks, but generally speaking, the hands that pay up are more often hands that we're competing against, and that would mean that they have better aces than ours. So, ace jack, ace 10, ace 9. So we don't exactly have a bet by value. Now, can we bet by bluff? Here, not at all, because all the hands up against ours will call. So ace 4 will call, clearly a double pair will call, everyone with an ace will call. So here we can't bet by bluff. Now, can we bet by protection? Here we really have nothing to protect, so if we had a better hand than we have now, if we had a queen and a king or a pair of tens, an 8 and a 7, then 99% of the time we will have had the best hand from the start. So in this case, we would want to bet to protect the cards that will help us have a better hand later. So here we have no reason to bet by value, no reason to bet by bluff, and no reason to bet for protection. And that's probably why we won't be placing a continuation bet in this case, but rather we'll calmly check to keep the pot as it is. So if we decide to bet low, maybe when the flop drops here, it's not very advantageous to us to bet. So we've explained what a continuation bet is, when do we place one, and why. Now we're going to talk about how we should do it. What size bet should we place? And this is called, quite simply, sizing. Now, with sizing, the size of the bet that we're going to place will depend on the size of the pot. So, obviously, if the pot is pretty large, we're not going to place a bet of just 2 chips, So, we'll adapt our bet to the size of the pot. On the other hand, if the pot is quite small, then we'll place a bet of 10, 8, maybe 6 chips, but we're not going to bet 40 chips. So we're going to adapt the bet to the size of the pot. And we're also going to adapt our bet, not to our hand, but to the texture of the flop. So this means that we're going to bet based on what we have, and we're going to use a large bet when we have nothing, a small bet when we have very little, because if we do that, our opponents are going to end up realizing what we have. If every time that we have something we bet really strong, they're going to figure out, when we have nothing. So we're not going to bet based on what we have in our own hand, but rather based on the flop itself. So here with the flop of king 8-4, this is a flop, as I mentioned earlier, that is very dry, very little connected. So we don't need to bet very strong. We're going to bet a little bit more than half the pot in general, whether it fits into our hand or not. So we're going to be bet a bit more than half the pot, because if the bet's too expensive and the others have nothing, then they're just going to pass anyway. So we want that the bluff isn't too expensive for us, just in case we lose. So that's why we're not going to bet too much on this particular flop, whether it's by value, bluff, or for protection, because we don't want the bet to be too expensive for us. And then we need to have the strategy to nearly always bet the same. So I know that this is a bit complicated maybe for beginners, but it's the first approach to the continuation bet. So the second of the 4 figures on here, this time we have a flop that is very well connected. And as we mentioned earlier, this is a flop where we're rarely going to place a continuation bet by bluff. And here our hand has value because we have a pair of aces, a straight, and diamonds. So this is unfortunately a very dangerous flop for us, because our opponents could very often come back to us with a 4th card of the same suit, with a jack that would beat our hand, with a 10. So there are quite a few cards that would give us a run for our money. And in the flops, they're super connected, like this one, we're not going to place too expensive of a bet because our opponent will most likely have a better hand. And there will be several different hands that will compete with us. So any opponent with a hand that, like we mentioned earlier, like maybe a 9 or an 8, they could use that to force us with their hands. Now, maybe a hand that contains an ace or a 10 or maybe a jack, a 6. So there are quite a few hands that could raise our bet. So this could be very expensive for us, since those who will bet back at us, could be calling the bet quite expensive for us, since we're making up for all the times when the flop didn't help the guy at all. So here we're going to do something like almost the same size as the pot. So the pot has 26, so we could put something like 24, for example. We're going to have to reflect on a certain percentage of the pot. So when the flop is dry, we'd rather place a bet like 50% of the pot. When the flop is very well connected, we're going to bet something like 80 to 90% of the pot. And based on this, finally our hand and what we have, that will determine the sizing of the bet. So that is all for our introductory video about the continuation bet. We have a lot of things that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the profiles of the other opponents when we have someone who's calling us what we call a calling station, which means that they nearly always call a bet. And actually, with this kind of opponent, we'll place a continuation bet by bluff much less often. We haven't talked about the types of opponents who allow the continuation bet to make them get back into the game. There are many questions that we didn't get to chat about regarding the continuation bet, but we've gone over some beginner instructions that should help you as you continue to play on Come On Poker. So I wish you very happy viewing of this video, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.